Marcus had always been a collector of oddities. His small shop, Relics and Reveries, nestled in a forgotten corner of the city, was a sanctuary for those who sought the strange and the peculiar. Dusty shelves lined with old books, tarnished silverware, and faded portraits of people long gone gave the place a sense of eerie nostalgia. But it wasn't until the arrival of a peculiar antique that his life began to take a turn for the worse. The mirror arrived on a gray, rain-soaked afternoon. The deliveryman, a wiry fellow with an unsettling grin, didn't offer much in the way of conversation. He simply dropped the heavy, ornate frame onto the counter with a thud and left, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. Marcus didn't pay much attention to the man. His focus was entirely on the mirror. The frame was gilded, the gold leaf peeling in places, revealing the dark wood beneath. But it was the glass that caught his attention. The surface was oddly reflective, almost too perfect, as if it were a portal to another world. Curiosity piqued, Marcus wiped the glass clean, revealing an unsettling clarity that seemed out of place in such an old piece. He could see every detail of his reflection, the graying hair at his temples, the tired lines around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand as he touched the surface. There was something hypnotic about the mirror, something that made it hard to look away. For a moment, he felt as though the mirror was watching him, rather than the other way around. Despite the unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach, Marcus convinced himself that the mirror was just another interesting artifact to add to his collection. The shop had been slow lately, and he hoped this curious piece might draw in more customers, perhaps even a buyer willing to pay a good price. He hung the mirror on the back wall, where it could catch the light from the shop window, casting long, ghostly reflections across the floor. That night, as he closed up the shop and prepared to head home, Marcus found himself drawn back to the mirror. He stood before it, staring at his reflection until the shop's dim light seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the mirror and what it held within. The reflection stared back at him, but something was off. It wasn't his face that troubled him, it was the feeling that something, or someone, was staring back from beyond the glass. He shook off the thought, chalking it up to exhaustion, and turned away. But the feeling lingered, a gnawing sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of unease that Marcus couldn't explain. The mirror, which he had initially found fascinating, now seemed to cast a shadow over his entire shop. It wasn't just the way it reflected light, it was the way it seemed to absorb it, drawing the room's energy toward itself. Customers who wandered into Relics and Reveries would pause before it, their faces clouding with an almost imperceptible dread before they quickly moved on, avoiding the mirror as though it carried a curse. At night, when the shop was empty and the streets outside were quiet, Marcus found himself staring into the mirror for longer than he intended. Each time, his reflection seemed to grow stranger, more unfamiliar. He noticed small details that hadn't been there before, a flicker of movement in the background, a shadow that didn't belong, a flash of something dark in the corner of his eye. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him in the dim light of the shop. But the unease only grew. Marcus began to have strange dreams, nightmares, really. In these dreams, he would find himself standing before the mirror, unable to look away. The reflection in the glass was not his own, but something else entirely, something darker, twisted, and malevolent. It would smile at him, a slow, creeping smile that made his skin crawl. And then, just as he felt the darkness begin to reach out from the mirror, he would wake up, drenched in sweat, the image seared into his mind. During the day, the nightmares lingered, making it difficult to focus on his work. He started to dread closing time, knowing that he would be alone with the mirror once again. The mirror seemed to call to him, drawing him in despite the fear that now gnawed at him constantly. He tried to ignore it, to lose himself in the routine of running the shop, but the mirror was always there, lurking in the background, a silent presence that he couldn't escape. Then, the incident started. Small at first, objects in the shop moving on their own, the feeling of being watched, and cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. Marcus began to notice that his reflection in the mirror would sometimes lag behind his movements, as if the image in the glass was slightly out of sync with reality. He would raise his hand, and the reflection would follow a split second later. It was a small detail, but it filled him with an overwhelming sense of dread. One evening, as he was locking up the shop, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the reflection, just behind him, there was a figure, a shadowy shape that shouldn't have been there. He spun around, heart pounding, but the shop was empty. He turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. But Marcus knew what he had seen. And he knew, deep down, that whatever was in that mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was something else, something that was becoming more real with each passing day. As the days wore on, Marcus became increasingly obsessed with the mirror. He found himself drawn to it at all hours, unable to resist the urge to stare into its depths. Each time, he hoped to see something that would explain the strange events, but all he saw was his own reflection, distorted, twisted, and increasingly foreign. It was as if the mirror was slowly revealing a version of himself that he didn't recognize, a version that terrified him. The breaking point came one stormy evening. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the shop, but inside, it was deathly silent. Marcus stood before the mirror, his heart racing. The shop's lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. For a moment, he thought he saw something move in the reflection, a dark figure lurking just beyond the glass. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only his pale, drawn face staring back at him. But then, as he stared deeper into the mirror, something changed. The glass seemed to ripple, distorting his reflection until it was no longer his own. Instead, he saw a scene unfolding, a room, dimly lit, with the mirror hanging on the wall. In the reflection, a man stood in front of the mirror, his back to Marcus. The man looked familiar, and it took Marcus a moment to realize that it was himself. He watched, frozen in place, as the scene played out. The other version of himself, his reflection, moved slowly, almost methodically. He walked across the room, and Marcus could see the weariness in his movements, the deep shadows under his eyes. The reflection reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as he watched himself, his reflection, lift the knife to his own throat. It was then that Marcus realized what he was seeing, his own death. The mirror was showing him the exact moment when he would die. The reflection hesitated, the knife trembling in its grip, and for a brief moment, Marcus thought he could stop it, could change the outcome. But as the knife pressed against the skin, he knew it was inevitable. The reflection was merely a shadow of what was to come. He tried to look away, to break the mirror's hold on him, but he couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the scene unfolding before him, unable to do anything but watch as the reflection's hand grew steadier, the knife pressing deeper into the flesh. Blood welled up, dark and thick, spilling down the reflection's neck as it collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Marcus gasped, stumbling backward, tearing his gaze away from the mirror. The shop was silent, the air heavy with the scent of something burning, though there was no fire. He looked back at the mirror, but the vision was gone. The glass was smooth and clear, reflecting only his own horrified expression. But the image of his own death was burned into his mind, vivid and inescapable. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, trying to erase the image, but it was no use. The mirror had shown him his fate, and he knew there was no escaping it. The knowledge weighed on him like a stone, crushing him under its inevitability. He had seen his own death, and now it was only a matter of time before it came to pass. Every time he glanced at the mirror after that night, he saw it, not in the glass, but in his mind. The blood, the knife, the lifeless body, it haunted him, a constant reminder of what was to come. The mirror had shown him his end, and with each passing day, he felt it drawing closer, an inescapable doom that no amount of willpower could avert. Marcus's life quickly unraveled after the vision. The mirror's curse had sunk its claws into him, and there was no escaping its grip. He became a shadow of his former self, consumed by the knowledge of his impending death. The once thriving shop fell into disrepair, the shelves gathering dust as Marcus neglected his business, too preoccupied with the dark fate that loomed over him. The nightmares that had plagued him before became more vivid, more terrifying. Each night, he would relive the vision from the mirror, but with new, horrifying details. He saw himself from different angles, heard the wet gurgle of blood as the knife sliced through flesh, felt the coldness of the floor as his body crumpled. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the taste of blood in his mouth, as if the vision had been real. Desperate to escape the curse, Marcus tried everything he could think of. He attempted to sell the mirror, but no one would buy it. Those who showed interest would recoil in horror the moment they laid eyes on the glass, their faces going pale as if they, too, sensed the evil that lurked within. He tried to destroy it, smashing the frame and shattering the glass, but each time he did, the mirror would reappear, whole and unscathed, back on the wall as if it had never been touched. He reached out to priests, occultists, anyone who might have a solution, but none could help him. They spoke of ancient curses, of spirits trapped in the glass, but no one knew how to break the mirror's hold on him. Each attempt to rid himself of the mirror only made the curse stronger, the vision of his death clearer in his mind. The paranoia that had been gnawing at him began to consume him entirely. He felt as though the mirror was watching him, waiting for the right moment to deliver his fate. He could feel its eyes on him even when he wasn't looking at it, a constant, oppressive presence that weighed down on him like a suffocating blanket. He took to covering it with a sheet, but even then, he could feel its gaze piercing through the fabric, taunting him with the knowledge of his own mortality. Marcus started to see death everywhere. The shadows in his shop seemed darker, the corners more menacing. He would catch glimpses of his own reflection in other surfaces, windows, puddles, polished silverware, and each time, he would see the same twisted smile, the same bloodshot eyes staring back at him. The world around him began to warp, becoming as distorted as the visions in the mirror, until he could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. One night, driven to the brink of madness, Marcus decided to confront the mirror one last time. He stood before it, trembling with fear and anger, his reflection staring back at him with that same twisted grin. He screamed at it, demanding to know why it had chosen him, what it wanted from him. But the mirror offered no answers, only the cold, unyielding truth of his fate. As he stared into the glass, the vision began to play out again, but this time, it was different. The reflection showed him not just his death, but the moments leading up to it, the choices he had made, the people he had wronged, the regrets that had haunted him. It was as if the mirror was showing him that his fate was not just inevitable, but deserved. He had brought this curse upon himself, and there was no escaping the consequences. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of him. The mirror had not just shown him his death, it had judged him. And in its cold, reflective surface, Marcus saw himself for what he truly was, a man who had spent his life collecting the macabre, the cursed, the forgotten, without ever considering the consequences. Now, those very things had come back to claim him. In the days that followed, Marcus's attempts to rid himself of the mirror grew increasingly desperate. He tried to give it away, but everyone who came near it felt an inexplicable sense of dread and refused to take it. He even tried to destroy it again, this time with fire, smashing it with hammers, and even burying it in the dead of night. But no matter what he did, the mirror always reappeared, whole and untouched, hanging on the wall as if it had never been moved. The weight of his impending doom was unbearable. Marcus could no longer eat or sleep, the vision of his death haunted him every moment. The shop, once a place of curious treasures, had become a tomb, with the mirror as its grim centerpiece. He could feel the end drawing closer with each passing day, a ticking clock that only he could hear, counting down to the moment when the vision would come true. One cold, rainy night, Marcus decided that he could take it no longer. He would confront the mirror once and for all and face whatever fate it had in store for him. He walked into the shop, now dark and empty, and stood before the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, calm and resigned, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Marcus took a deep breath and picked up the knife that had appeared in the vision, now resting on the counter as if it had always been there. The blade was cold and sharp, its surface reflecting the dim light of the shop. He knew what he had to do. The mirror had shown him how it would end. There was no escape, no way out. The mirror had sealed his fate, and now he would fulfill it. With trembling hands, Marcus raised the knife to his throat, just as he had seen in the vision. His reflection followed every movement, a perfect mirror image of his own actions. As the blade pressed against his skin, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The fear that had consumed him for so long was gone, replaced by a numb acceptance of the inevitable. As the knife began to cut, Marcus's vision blurred, and he felt himself falling to the floor. The mirror's reflection, now smeared with blood, seemed to smile at him, a cruel, twisted grin that mirrored his own. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own lifeless body reflected in the glass, just as the mirror had shown him. When the police found him the next morning, they couldn't explain what had happened. The shop was in disarray, but there were no signs of a struggle. Marcus was dead, his body lying in a pool of blood, the knife still clutched in his hand. The mirror, now cracked and tarnished, hung silently on the wall, its surface reflecting only the empty room. The mirror was eventually removed and taken to an evidence locker, where it sat, gathering dust. But those who came near it reported strange occurrences, visions of their own deaths, cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, and the feeling of being watched. It was as if the mirror still held a piece of Marcus's soul, trapped in its reflective surface, waiting for its next victim. And so the mirror's curse lived on, its dark power undiminished, forever binding those who gazed into it to the fate it had in store. Marcus had thought he could escape the curse, but in the end, the mirror had been right all along. Knowing your fate only brings the inevitable closer.